Crossroads Cultural Center and the Movement of Communion and Liberation welcome to tonight's event, Caring for Our Common Home. Our intention tonight is to begin a conversation on Pope Francis's encyclical, Laudato Si', released in May of this year. We want to start to unpack the meaning of the Pope's words, understanding their relevance against the horizon of our own lives. At the very beginning of the encyclical, Pope Francis mentions that he wishes to address every person living on the planet, which most certainly begins with us. How does the Pope's message impact how we enter into political, social, and cultural life? How does the Pope's message impact how we enter into our relationship with Christ and His Church? Turning our ear to what the Pope is telling us has particular importance now, as we begin to prepare for his historic visit to the United States and anticipate what he will say in his address to the Joint Congress, his speech at the UN, and during his presence at the World Meeting of Families. To help us to begin this conversation, we have Father José MEDINA, the national leader of the ecclesial movement of communion and liberation. Our intention for the evening is simply to outline a few key points before opening up the floor to questions from the audience. So to begin, Laudato Si' proposes a broad reach. As I just quoted, Pope Francis intended the encyclical to be for everyone, not merely for Catholics. In other words, the type of ecology that Pope Francis proposes in this sense, it is reminiscent of what Pope Benedict said in his speech to the German Bundestag, where he spoke of the recovery of the natural law and said, "I would say that the emergence of the ecological movement was and continues to be a cry for fresh air, which must not be ignored or pushed aside, just because too much of it is seen to be irrational. Young people had to come to realize that something is wrong in our relationship with nature, that matter is not just raw material for us to shape at will, but that the earth has a dignity of its own and that we must follow its directives. Yet I would like to underline a point that seems to me to be neglected. Today, as in the past, there is also an ecology of man. Man too has a nature that he must respect and that he cannot manipulate at will. In this way, an ecological discussion or dialogue is one that helps orient our dialogue with those inside and outside the church to a rediscovery of a true ecology of man. So the question is, to start us off, what context does this offer to help understand what Pope Francis is teaching us? Why does he choose the environment or ecology as a starting point to help educate us as to what it is to be in dialogue with others?
When Crossroads asked me to do this and when Amy helped me to prepare for it, we agreed that I was not going to actually give you a presentation on the encyclical, because you can read it yourself. Since it's for everybody, as Amy was just saying, that includes us. So, but I thought it could be a good thing to actually have a conversation about some of the questions. The first being the one that you, Amy, are highlighting right now. It is, what do they see? What do these two popes, even as Pope Francis at the beginning of the encyclical highlights, the interest, starting from Paul VI, especially Benedict and John Paul II, and now Pope Francis, what interest do they have in ecology? Why should we care about this? Why, at this particular point in time in which we feel there are so many things that are urgent, we should actually put our attention to the environment? And the beginning of the answer to me is highlighted by the Pope in the encyclical in saying that, and he says this word, there is also the fact that people no longer seem to believe in a happy future. They no longer have blind trust in a better tomorrow, based on the present state of the world and our technical abilities. It's the same thing that Benedict saw in that speech in the Bundestag when he was saying he was highlighting something is wrong in our relationship between ourselves and nature. And he highlights the fact that young people are the people who are noticing this the most. It is interesting that ecology has become, and it is, the greatest criticism to a modern understanding of life. As if it is in the ecological environmental movement where we find a true conversation about who is man and what is this relationship between man and nature, how this relationship should be. So to begin to answer the question, this question of the environment interests everyone. It interests everyone not only because it is part of our conversation, daily conversation, but also because it brings to the forefront a very big question mark that many of us have with regards to the ability of the world as it is today to provide with a happy future. I find very striking many times how obsessed we are with dystopian movies, in which how many times you can hear even like people, like great people into technology, warning the world about don't get into artificial intelligence. Elon Musk, people from Facebook, from Google. Suddenly, man, modern man, has a question with regards to who is man. The people that are, like Elon Musk is the guy who is trying to go to Mars, the people who are most in the avant-garde of progress, have a question with regards to whether we should take the next step or not. So I think that this is a very interesting aspect and worth giving the attention that the Pope has decided to give it. The second thing is that he does so by inviting to a dialogue. And I think that this is not a small thing. In multiple points in the encyclical, he will comment about the fact that this question of who is man, what is our relationship with nature, what is our relationship with one another, and what is our relationship with ourselves, the ecology of man that Amy was highlighting before, requires a dialogue from everyone: scientists, economists, politicians, ourselves, people, and religious people. This dialogue, the way he understands it, is not a trying, in the desire of trying to find common ground, meaning let's try to agree into something, but the desire of using of all of these aspects of our life, in the economy, science, politics, or religion, to get to know who man is better. Meaning different perspectives of the same problem can help us to understand who we are. This sense of the rediscovery of man that cannot be done unless there is this dialogue opens a lot of questions to us. What it means to have a true conversation that is an exploration, that is a listening to one another, which is not something that in our culture and in our country we are very used to, because we think of interactions as affirmation of one's position and not dialogue.
Great. Certainly this type of dialogue that you're pointing to, that Pope Francis is helping to educate us towards, is very different than the type of political dialogue that we tend to think about. What would you say is the position of us, of others, to take in front of people that we might enter into these dialogues with? You mentioned that this type of dialogue isn't merely sort of acquiescing to find common ground, and it's true that we need to authentically be ourselves in dialogue with others. What type of position would I need to have in front of the other in this dialogue in order for it to become fruitful in the way we would hope for?
I think the interesting thing of Pope Francis, and this is one of the most striking themes of the encyclical, is this. It's a double sense. One is the awareness of the fact that the greatest problem that we have, or the reason of the ecological crisis and the social crisis, the violence that we have, is because everything is very fragmented. And this sense of fragmentation that he will talk a lot about through the encyclical means that everything is sort of like thought about disconnected from everything else. He repeats this sentence over and over: everything is connected. Even when he goes over some biological or chemical examples, he's talking always about this ecosystem. When he's talking about the environment and nature, he needs to bring forth the relationship between countries, the relationship between people. This sense of everything is connected, which he at the very beginning quotes from Benedict XVI, saying that even talking about, he says, quoting Benedict XVI, the book of nature is one and indivisible. And he continues, includes the environment, life, sexuality, the family, social relations, and so forth. So it's very interesting because Pope Francis's position is one of unity. And he sees as the greatest difficulty of our time, or the origin of our of the violence and the disrespect towards nature and towards one another, in this lack of unity. So when he's thinking about it, he's thinking from a unified perspective, which means that the other belongs to me in a way. So dialogue is ultimately for Pope Francis an affirmation of the other as someone good to me. Dialogue is not, it's interesting that for Pope Francis, the other person, that it can be the President of Israel, or Palestine, or the President of Cuba, or the poor person or the rich person. The other is someone that is part of the created, and therefore belongs to me, has this sense of a very fraternal experience to it. So when he thinks about the other, that I don't agree with, he begins from a position of affection. This is why Pope Francis speaks so much about mercy. Mercy not as resulting from the awareness that I am limited, and therefore I have to accept the limitedness of the other people around me, but from the affection of the fact that you belong to the same one I belong to. So he thinks of dialogue as talking to my brother, which is profoundly different to the way in which we think about dialogue, even among each other. To the point that he highlights continuously relationship over discussion of ideas. If one of the things that I would highlight of this Pope that makes him who he is that he cares about relationship. For him, everything is relationship. So, I was reading in a biography of this Pope that Father Lombardi, who takes care of the press for him, was saying that the difference between Benedict and Francis is that Benedict, after a meeting, would have a very clear sense of what the conversation should be and how it should proceed, in a much more sense of a diplomatic, how do we move this relationship forward. For Pope Francis, everything is the person, is the affirmation of the other. So to dialogue with the other means to dialogue with someone that already belongs to me from the very beginning.
It seems to me that in order to be able to look at the other with this type of affection or with the gaze of mercy, as you described, that one must be really aware of what it is to see reality with this unity. You helped us to understand a little bit more what the Pope means when he says ecology of man, that someone who lives very deeply the fact that life exists as some type of ecosystem where everything is connected. In order to be able to learn more, to return to this position of unity and to embrace that as a starting point, how do you grow in this sort of integral approach, as Pope Francis would say? How do you begin to discover this unity of life? We see from the encyclical that the environment becomes sort of a metaphor to discover this, what it means for man to live in relation to nature. But can you tell us a little bit more about how one lives this integral approach to reality?
I think this is an interesting question in the sense that as the Pope is talking or describing the environment and saying this is what we have, this preoccupation of living a good world for our children, no? And this world is not in a good place. And he says we've tried, and he highlights, we've tried a technological approach. We've tried the approach of the law, creating regulations, and both of them have failed. His proposal is what you were asking of, discovering this sense of unity. And the discovery of this sense of unity can only happen if we, and he says at some point, speak of the figure of the Father. For him, the only possibility for us to understand what our place in the world is not more laws. And therefore, this is the reason why he doesn't highlight as much, saying this is what your relationship should be. But he, in a sense, is pointing us towards the origin of all of those laws. He's pointing us to the root of it. So he says, the best way to restore men and women to the rightful place, putting an end to their claim to absolute domination over the earth, is to speak once more of the figure of a father who creates and who alone owns the world. So it's very interesting, and therefore it goes back to why he speaks so much of mercy. He speaks the possibility of a change in behavior, in our behavior towards the created, can only happen in as much as we are aware of the fact that we are created ourselves. But this awareness, this is the second step, is not a matter of just knowing that I am created, but is growing in awareness of this fact here, that I belong in a sense to another, that I was created by someone. He insists over and over that the only possibility for an answer to the human crisis that we are living today is a growth in self-awareness of our being sons of someone.
It's interesting that you highlight technology and the law as two places that modern man tends to turn to try to fix the problem of political crises, environmental crises, etc., etc. And that runs as an enormous theme throughout the entirety of the encyclical. In fact, it's been said by many people that this is a decidedly anti-modern Pope, and the encyclical as such is also very anti-modern. And this was a big criticism of the encyclical, that Pope Francis sort of condemns modern liberal institutions wholesale. Why do you think that he was so strong on this point? And in particular, looking at this question of technology. He rejects very, very firmly this sort of technological ontology, what he describes at some point as the way that humanity has taken up technology and its development according to an undifferentiated and one-dimensional paradigm. This paradigm exalts the concept of a subject who, using logical and rational procedures, progressively approaches and gains control over an external object. In a similar way, the way that he thinks that his technological understanding of progress is going to be insufficient for being able to undergird the types of dialogue that we want to have, a legal approach, depending on the law as being sort of salvific for the many problems that we face, is also a very reduced approach. So So why this insistence, this very anti-modern strand that we see in the encyclical, rejection of technology and law as a rightful place of our hope?
Well, I think it's probably one of the most beautiful, my favorite parts in the encyclical is when the Pope talks about work and the dimension of work. Because there is a part of it in which he's talking about technology as how does man relate to the created, and what it means, the fact that you want to fulfill the created, and how it's a good thing that we have technology and that we can battle against illness or sickness, that we can make the world more, and this is where the difference is, more beautiful, meaning more resplendent of the face of the Creator. Because ultimately, for Pope Francis, everything that is done is always an affirmation of the relationship with the Father. The interesting thing, and therefore his criticism to a very technocratic paradigm that believes that we can actually solve every problem, is a way of thinking of oneself as disconnected. His criticism, for example, to the relationships that can exist, and he's spoken about this multiple times with young people in Manila, is the last time that I think of, that I can remember, about the lack or the poverty of the relationships that exist online. The fact that you can have a relationship with a person, but that you can basically click and make disappear. And it goes back to the things that I was highlighting at the beginning, is the desire of connectedness that he highlights continuously, the need of the other. And therefore the need of the other in order to be myself, and this strong sense of unity with the other. Technology has the capacity to actually fragment the experience. So in many ways, it's the experience that we see in many young people today that they talk a lot about of, I can have 400 friends on Facebook, but then I feel alone. This is the criticism, ultimate criticism to technology or the law. It is true that he's a very anti-modern pope in the strong sense of the word, because he's like any of the other popes before, because he believes that it's only in relationship with the Father that I can be fulfilled.